everybody, my name is Leila. Welcome to my channel. Today we have special guest is Professor Lawrence Baden. Hello.
Layla,
Welcome.
it's nice to see you again.
Thank you.
Always good to see you.
Thank you so much. Well, Professor Larry Baden has 10 years of experience as a newspaper reporter in Missouri, Colorado, and Nevada. Well, and 29 years of teaching experience at Webster University. I have several questions related to news reporting.
Great.
Well, my first question is about your journalism field. How did you become interested in this field? What was your motive?
That's kind of a big and complicated question. I think, like most things, I kind of just fell into it. I never really thought when I was in high school about how I would make a living or what I would study in college. When I was a junior in high school, we were supposed to take a trip to a car manufacturing plant where they were making the car Corvettes. And I was really excited about this. We were going to see the assembly line where they made the cars.
Mhm.
And then the day of the field trip, it turned out there was a change of plans, and we went to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper instead. And I remember thinking in the morning how disappointed I was, because it's like, how lame is that? Who wants to go to a newspaper? There can't be anything interesting there. But I do remember there being like two moments during the tour of the newspaper. I remember us being in the newsroom and seeing all these people who were kind of looked a little bit like me because they're kind of geeky, and it turns out they covered sports for a living. They went to games and they wrote about games. I was like, wait, you can do that for a living? That sounds better than working. And then a little bit later at the end of the tour, we went and we were watching the paper get printed. And I remember seeing the printing press, and it's just massive. It's just a huge room. It's noisy. There's all these moving parts, and the paper's just flying through this thing. And you're watching it. It was one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen in my life. And then the pressman, he takes the paper as it's coming off the press and he hands it to you. And I remember that moment, Layla, when he handed me that newspaper. I remember getting chills and looking at that newspaper and say, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. It would be so cool to see my story or my name at the top of that newspaper. And that was kind of the moment I started thinking about becoming a journalist.
Wow, it was so lovely.
Way
Well,
longer story than you were hoping to hear.
yeah, we will listen like. While you were working as a newspaper reporter, I believe you faced lots of challenges. Could you tell me which one was the hardest and how you overcome this?
Interesting. I mean, I guess, I don't know. When you're a reporter, it's a business where you're always working on deadline and you're always worried about your next story. And so it's a business, and part of what was great about it is that you could never be bored. There was always something exciting, interesting going on. And so I don't really remember thinking about what the challenges were. I just kind of remember being in the moment, and a lot of times thinking, wow, I'm doing something that's really cool that a lot of people would really love to do. I'm meeting people most people don't get to meet. I'm asking people questions most people don't get to ask, and I'm writing stories, which I love to do. And so when you're doing it, you're just doing it. So you don't spend a lot of time thinking about what makes this hard. I think that if I had to answer, the one thing that was most difficult was kind of later in my career as a reporter, as my kids were starting school. I think when my son went to kindergarten, and he started being involved in things at school, and he started having things happen in his life, and I was missing them because I was reporting stories, or I was traveling and was in a different part of the country. I think kind of missing things happening in my kid's life was the hardest. For probably the 10 of the 12 years or so that I was working in newsrooms, I probably worked on Christmas 10 of those 12 years. And so it, you know, that didn't matter that much when it was me and my wife. We could celebrate, Christmas kind of on our own schedule. But when you have young kids, and now it's like waking up on Christmas morning is a big deal, and now it's like, okay, open the presents, and then I'm running off to work. It's like, okay, this is different. If you're asking about what the hardest thing journalistically was, or the hardest thing reporting was, probably my own personality was the most difficult part of it, in that I tended to beat myself up, and no story was ever good enough. And so no matter what the story was, I'd almost always be disappointed that it wasn't better than it was. And that can start to make you crazy pretty quickly. And so I had to learn to be okay with not being perfect, with knowing that there were going to be people who I wish I had interviewed and put in a story that I couldn't always get. And I had to learn to be okay with that, not writing the perfect story. That was hard.
I see. Thank you. Well, journalism has many types, such as sports, art, fashion, culture, etc. What was your main sphere, like main type? And have you tried some types or spheres as a journalist?
That's a very interesting question, because I think that's how most people see journalism, is I'm going to be a sports reporter, or I'm going to be a fashion reporter, or I'm going to be a photojournalist. I believe that there's only really one kind of journalist, and that's that we all do the same thing. It's just a matter of how well do we do it, how effectively we do it. And so I always felt like I wanted to be someone who, no matter what the story was assigned to me, that I would cover it better than almost anyone else would. And I didn't care if it was a court story, or if it was a crime story, or a sports story. I just loved reporting whatever the story was. As I got further along in my career, I kind of gravitated towards covering sports. And I think the reason why that happened was, as a storyteller, there's almost always someone who's going to triumph in sports. And so there's always a story arc, because there's someone who's overcoming something. And usually that someone is ending the story triumphantly. And so I really like telling that kind of story about someone who overcomes this challenge and then becomes great, or someone who overcomes this obstacle and then becomes champion. So over my career, I kind of just transitioned towards sports. And by the end, that's just about all I was covering. Was in the United States, Major League Baseball, and American football.
I see. Thank you. Well, so as an editorial advisor to the award-winning Webster Journal for 8 years. What kind of methods do you use to develop students' journalistic creativity?
I had a very, I think, different view about how the newspaper fit into my students' education than a lot of other educators, a lot of other college newspaper advisors. What I wanted my students to, most college journalism advisors, their goal tends to be for their students to produce the best newspaper they can produce. That was never my goal. My goal always was for that newspaper to help young journalists grow. And so it never bothered me if a student made a mistake. It never bothered me if a student wrote a bad story, as long as it enabled us to learn from that mistake. And so a student who writes a story that's here this week, as long as their story is here next week, then we've done what we needed to do. And if their story is here next week and then it's a little bit better the week after that, the idea is that over 16 weeks of a semester, if you go from here to here, you've made great improvement. And over the course of 4 years, if you've gone from here to here, you're probably going to be a pretty darn good journalist by the time you graduate.
Yeah.
And so to me, the newspaper was never the ends. It was never all about the newspaper. It was about how do we use that newspaper to make students better as journalists, as reporters, as editors, as photographers, as videographers. And so that's always how I looked at it. It's the way I still look at it. Sometimes that's frustrating to university administrators who they want to look at the newspaper and they want it to be perfect. And they want there to never ever be any mistakes in the newspaper. That's not the real world. The real world, people make mistakes. And the question is, do you keep making them, or do you learn from them and do you grow and you become better? And so there was always sometimes this philosophical tension between me as the advisor and administrators of the school, who they wanted a newspaper that was always perfect. They wanted me as the advisor and former professional to go through and to correct all of the mistakes before it was published. And my point was always, no, I want it to be the student's newspaper. And if they make mistakes, then we're going to learn from those mistakes. And so that's how we've done it.
I see.
And kind of having that philosophy, along the way, we've had some kids do some pretty amazing, incredible journalism through the years.
Yeah, that's great. Well, journalists are a bridge between the government and the people. They are the mirrors to show the people's problems in society. How have you ever written a critical articles? Well, in Uzbek language, there is a word we say feuilleton. When I Google it, there was a French term feuilleton, the same word term. Which is a newspaper, and topical satire is widely used among journalists. And I'm just asking you, have you ever written these types of feuilleton in your career?
Are you saying satire?
Yes,
as in
satire.
satirical?
Yep, articles.
I have not. I kind of come from the old school where my job was not to impose my opinions on my reader. My job is to tell my audience, here's what's happening. Now you make up your own mind about what you think about it. So that's kind of the way I was raised as a journalist, was not to impose my judgments on my audience. At the Journal, when I got to Webster, the Journal used to do a April Fool's issue, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with April Fools, but on April 1st, people play jokes on each other. And the students would put out a joke newspaper where they would write fake news stories, satire. And oftentimes the stories were quite clever and were pretty funny, and it'd be like, okay, yeah, that's great. I hated when the students did that, and I worked very hard to convince them not to do that satirical issue every year. And eventually they either just wanted me to shut up and stop nagging them about it, or they came to agree with me. And what I said to the students back then was, you spend all year working to try to get the administrators, the faculty, the staff, and the students at the school to take you seriously as professionals. Why would you then write a satirical publication that shows exactly the opposite, that you're not to be taken seriously as a professional? Why would we waste that opportunity to produce something that's great journalism so that we can try to be funny? And so that's kind of never really been my inclination for something that I want to do. I have great appreciation for, are you familiar with The Onion? The publication The Onion? I recommend that you look up The Onion. It is a satirical newspaper in the United States. And it's really, really funny. And it puts up a mirror and shows us quite often how ridiculous we are as a society, as a country, as people. And I admire it and I appreciate it. I just don't want to produce it. I like news. I think, especially in the world we live in the United States now, in the age of fake news, it's more important now than it's ever been for journalists to be serious about being truth tellers and getting things right, and not producing satire. We can leave that to Saturday Night Live and The Onion. And
I'll definitely read. Well, if democracy doesn't work in a country, journalists should be biased government and the president. However,
journalists should be
biased government and the president. I don't mean the America, I mean the some countries. However, there are such journalists who would like free speech and are never scared to tell the truth openly. What's your opinion about this and what's your advice?
I think that I feel very blessed to have been able to be a journalist and to teach journalism in a country that historically, from the roots of our country with the First Amendment, have recognized the important role that a free press plays in a democratic society. I feel extremely lucky that I got to work in a place where I can walk into the police department and ask them for their records so I can look at how they're doing what they do, and I can write about them even if it's things that aren't going to make them happy. One thing I'm really fortunate to do in my job is about 2 or 3 times a year, I get to meet with journalists from around the world who come to the United States to learn about journalism in the United States. And pretty recently, I was able to meet with journalists from China and share ideas with them and talk to them. And it was so impacting on me to hear the fine line they walked in terms of them knowing what was truthful and what they wanted to report to their readers and what the government was going to allow them to report, or what the government was going to not punish them if they reported otherwise. And you asked me what I think of these folks. These were some of the bravest, most courageous people I think I've ever met, because every day they're walking this very precarious line between trying to correctly, accurately inform their audience, knowing that there are government people who are watching every word that they publish, looking for a reason to fire them from their job or take them out of their position or, put them into jail. I have met and talked with journalists from Middle Eastern countries who have told me stories about them being snatched off the streets in the middle of the night and blindfolded and taken somewhere and left in a dark room isolated, and then being beaten for things that they'd written, and then being released and being out there a week later trying to cover the same stories or similar stories that got them beaten. I mean, that's just a level of courage that's difficult for me to even fathom, because of all kind of the privilege that we have as journalists in the United States.
I see. Thank you. Well, I found most interesting information about you. You have studied at Webster University ethics in media and studied journalism University of Missouri, and also you studied education and composition and rhetoric at University of Nevada, doctoral degree, I think, right?
Yes.
Wow. The development. Well, can professor learn student some aspects of teaching methods?
Can
professors learn students some aspect of teaching methods?
So could I share with students methods in teaching? I just want to make sure I'm understanding you
While
correctly.
you were teaching students, did you learn some aspects that really help for your teaching methods, that I mean?
Yes, and my educational path was different than most people. So most people who teach journalism, they study as an undergraduate, they study journalism, and then most go and they work in journalism, and then they come back to school and they get a master's in journalism, and then they get a PhD in journalism. I studied journalism as an undergrad, and then I went and worked as a journalist, as a reporter. And then when I came back to school, I didn't study journalism. I studied education, and that's what my master's degree is in, because I wanted to learn the best practices for how to teach someone something. I kind of felt, I've been immersed in journalism now for 14, 15 years. I understand journalism. Now, how do I teach that? I understood it was different kind of storytelling than what I do as a journalist. And then with my doctoral studies, I even went further away and started looking at composition and rhetoric, um, and learning more about how we use language to share ideas and how we use language to create new knowledge. And I think that that really helped me to become a better teacher. But you're asking me, what have I learned from this experience that helps make me more effective as a teacher? This is going to be somewhat ironic since I've just been talking and talking and talking during our interview. I know that I am probably being more effective as a teacher the less I talk.
I see.
The more I talk, probably the less teaching I'm doing. The less I talk, there's probably more learning going on in the classroom. And so my goal is to get my students engaged so that they're teaching and learning from each other, and I'm kind of just directing where the conversation goes. You have been a student in my media law and ethics class, and there are some days where I have to do a lot of lecture because of circumstance or topic. I hate those days, and I'm always looking and thinking, okay, I'm delivering a lot of information, a lot of content here. Now I need to do something to help students actually interact with it and to use it so that it becomes real to them, and that they start to understand it better and understand how it helps them. So to me, and I have kind of these two silly mottos for teaching. The first is that students don't care what you know until they know that you care. So one thing I try to convey to students is that I care about you as a human being. And it's not just about me teaching you for 80 minutes on a Monday and Wednesday in advanced reporting. It's about me helping you to accomplish and achieve the things you want to accomplish in life. So that's kind of the first motto. Students don't care what you know until they know that you care. And then I think once they know you care, it becomes easier to teach someone, because there's this kind of trust that grows from that. And then the other motto is talk less, teach more. When students are talking, they're going to be more engaged, and the learning is going to become more meaningful to them. And so that's kind of the strategy I try to use.
Yes, I feel this class. Well, the development of the internet affects highly on press, the publication of newspaper. What's your opinion about the demand for publishing newspaper and reading that might be eliminated in the future?
That's a pretty hard question. And we are 3 decades into the World Wide Web now. So it's not like it's a new thing. And yet we're still dealing with this question of how is this shift in where we get news going to affect us? Just by coincidence, when I got out of newspaper and went into teaching, was exactly the same year that the World Wide Web was created. And so my career has kind of paralleled this revolution. And so, can you hand me the newspaper right there? So when I started teaching, that'll work. It's torn, but it'll work for my purposes. So when I started teaching, I was teaching people to tell stories on this. And then the internet became available in most American homes, and people bought either PCs or eventually laptops. And then I was trying to teach students to write stories for this thing. And how does it change the dynamic when the news isn't just falling onto your driveway at 4:30 in the morning, but the news can come to you into your home anytime, night or day? How does it affect the way I tell the story when I'm not just using words and pictures, but now I can use video, I can use interactive graphics, I can use audio? How does this change the storytelling? So eventually, I had to start teaching students how to tell stories on this thing. And after a while, I started to feel pretty comfortable with it and like we were doing a pretty good job. And then all of a sudden, I got to teach students how to tell stories on this thing. And telling stories on this thing is way different from telling stories on this thing, and really different from telling stories on this thing, right?
Yep.
So now I have to reinvent how I teach because this is a different kind of storytelling. Long form doesn't work on this, right? Someone doesn't want to read a story that starts on the front page and then goes to page 3 and it's almost all of page 3. Yep. And if my fingers worked, we could see it. Actually, it's all of page 2. No one is going to want to read that on this. Much more visual. Video works on this. Audio works on this. Text works in short bursts. So you have to be a different kind of storyteller on this than you were on this. And to me, the important thing is whether or not people are getting their news from this or this or this. There's still a need for us to be informed.
I see.
And print newspapers might someday go away, but in a healthy, functioning society, news can't go away. We really, really need people who can tell us about the important issues of the day. And so a lot of people lose sleep over it. I don't. To me, it just gets more interesting because this produces challenges that this didn't produce, but it also produces a power for journalists that this doesn't produce. I can reach my audience anytime, day or night, on this thing. Here I could reach my audience one time a day when this thing ended up on their driveway at 5:30 in the morning. I can use video here. I can use audio here. So to me, this is more powerful, and it makes being a journalist way more complicated, but it also makes being a journalist much more interesting, I think. So I think in the end, it will be like most media. There will be good things about it. There will be really bad things about it. And as consumers, hopefully we'll learn how to gravitate towards the good and ignore the not good.
I see. Well, there is not a question, but my humble request is, could you give some advice to help the development of young students who study journalism major?
I could give lots of advice, but I will just give one. I'll limit it to one thing that I think is the most important. If you want to be great at journalism, I think the one thing you have to be able to do is you've got to have what I think of as trained curiosity. That you start to notice things that other people don't notice, and then you start to systematically and productively ask questions about the things you're curious about. So the most important thing someone who wants to be a journalist can do is to start to have conversations with people from all over the place. If you are on a bus, start a conversation with the person sitting next to you. That person might be really, really interesting and have a important story to tell. If you are at a restaurant and there's someone at a table next to you and they seem like an interesting person, don't be afraid to start a conversation with them. You'll probably learn something interesting because there's probably a story that that person has to tell. Um, Societally, this thing maybe has taken us away from this. We're extremely comfortable texting with people. We're extremely comfortable sending a TikTok video for people to watch. In a way, we've become less comfortable sitting down and looking someone in the eye and having looking someone in the eye and having a conversation with them. And so it's really important that we practice that skill and we get used to and comfortable with talking to people who we don't know. So that would be my one piece of advice.
And it's really stressful.
Yeah, it can be stressful and it can be scary because there are lots of crazy people out there. But there also are a lot of really interesting people who will give us great ideas about important stories that we can tell.
Yes. Thank you for your spending time.
I'm honored to have been interviewed by you.
Thank you. Thanks for your attention. This is Layla, and today was our special guest, Lawrence Baden.